In this video, I'm gonna break down my mix on the Presonus Studiolive 64S. We've got some tracks from our friends at Thrive Worship, so let's hop into it. So I'm pretty happy with how this mix is shaping up. It took me about an hour to get everything from the default state of the console to be labeled, patched, and mixed to a place where I would feel really comfortable using it on a Sunday morning. And then I spent a little bit more time getting it further dialed into what you just heard. So this show file is free for you to be able to download and use at your church. Maybe if you don't have the time to start fresh and make a new one, you can use this as a really great starting place. But let me break down the show file to let you know kind of what you're getting into and what all is included in this. So just talking about some of the processing that I am doing, like I said, I'm not doing any group processing, but on the channels, this is all pretty standard stuff. Looking at the kicks, pretty big dip in the low mids to take out some of that boxiness, boost in the high end, boost in the low end. And this just helps me get enough low end punch from the kick and attack to be able to cut through the mix. I actually felt like whenever I was dialing this in that I wasn't getting enough. These EQs on the Studiolive only go up to 12 dB, and I felt like I just needed a little bit more punch with this kick drum, how it's tuned with this mic. And so what I actually did a way around that is I went up to the master bus and just did a little boost at 60 Hertz, just to be able to compensate for where I was missing some of that low end in the drums. As far as snare, again, pretty standard stuff for drums, mid cut, a boost at the fundamental of the drum to give it some body, and then some high end to be able to get some of that snap out of it. Toms are the same situation. Then moving over to our overheads, I've got a high pass filter to cut out some of that sub lows from overhead or from PA. Cut in the mid range to take out some of the boxiness. Hi-hat is the same story, just a little bit of a more dramatic cut. And let's just take a listen to that. I've also got a drum verb. This has snare and tom sending to it, so I'm not using separate verbs for these. You totally could with the amount of effects that this console has, but I'm just using one. So let's just listen to the drums soloed and let you get a feel for how those are feeling in the mix. All right, great, we've got our drums sounding good. Moving on to bass, again, there's nothing crazy happening here. This is pretty standard stuff. Looking at the channel strip, we've got some EQ here. So I've got a little boost around 700 to help with that mid-range, help the bass really cut through in the mix. And then a small boost at 60 Hertz. And then my high pass filter is set just below 60 to help the bass not interfere with the drums. Then looking at the compression, I've got a FET style compressor. This is actually emulating a 1176 analog unit, and I've got the ratio set to all. So this is the equivalent of pushing in all of the buttons on the analog unit, and it just gives you a really unique, like growly character to the compressor. And I mean, at times we're hitting 8 dB of compression, and what this is really doing is keeping that bass consistent in the PA. So the sub levels that I'm getting from the PA, they're not varying. It's just this nice low end bed in my mix, and this really just helps tie everything together. As far as attack and release, I've got a medium fast attack and very fast release, and I felt like that the bass just really sat well in the mix with these settings. So let's take a listen, bass by itself, and then I'm gonna even bring in the drums and see how those mesh together. We've got a really nice low end bed. So let's bring in the drums and see how those work in together. All right, great. So our drums and bass are feeling really good in that pocket. And moving on, we've got our guitars. So we've got 2 stereo electric guitars. These are just panned left and right. There's no weird panning where EG1 is to the left and EG2 is to the right. They're both just panned wide open. And then we've got a acoustic guitar. We've only got 1 acoustic guitar in these tracks, but there are 2 acoustic channels if you have that for your church. So let's listen to the guitars by themselves and then bring them into the context of the mix. Yeah, so it's feeling really nice. I feel like drums, bass, and guitars are really kind of the essentials of our mix. If those aren't sounding good, then the rest of our mix really isn't gonna have a good foundation to build on. So looking at the guitars processing, we've got our high pass filter around 200 Hertz, a little cut in the mid-range, it's around 450, and then a cut in the high mids that's at around 3K. And what this does is it helps keep those guitars out of the way of the vocal, so we can still keep intelligibility with the vocal when we add that in later down the road. And then looking at our AG1, our acoustic, we've just got a low mid cut around. We've got a low cut around 288 and then a low mid cut around 800. And this is just helping clean up the boxiness in the acoustic. And then just a very slight like 2 dB boost in the high frequency. So whenever we get this into the context of the mix, what this acoustic really acts as is a percussion instrument, almost like a shaker. And it just helps keep that rhythm even when the drums are not playing. So you can see that even with those 3 drums, bass, and guitars, we've got a really solid foundation. The drums are giving us that rhythm, the bass is offering that bed of low end, and then the guitars are offering that width and that brilliance in our mix, and they're all supporting each other really well. So moving on, we've got 2 keys channels. These are both stereo keys channels. One is piano and one is like a pad organ. So again, we'll just listen to them individually, then bring them into the mix and see how they're fitting. So this is just keys 1, this is the piano. And then we'll bring in keys 2, which is the organ. Yeah, so we're really getting some more of that high end from both of these keys channel. The keys 1, which is our piano and just regular ambient pad, is giving us a really good bed of like low mids. So where there's kind of a little bit of separation between the bass in kind of those sub low frequencies and the electrics in those high mids, that piano is fitting right in the middle of those 2 and just helping to complete our mix. And then that organ channel, that keys 2, gives us some great, just some great texture to to our mix. You know, it's almost in that similar frequency range of the guitars where it's offering that high-end width and brilliance. Everything's fitting in the pocket really well. And that's one thing to mention, that these musicians are really great. They're staying out of the way of each other, and it's allowing us to really craft our mix and create a really clean, full, balanced sound. But just because they are giving me good sources doesn't mean that I'm not processing them to help them fit into the mix. So looking at the Keys 1 channel, I'm doing actually a slight boost in the the mid-range, right around 800 or 900. And I felt like with these particular keys, they sounded a little bit scoopy. So there was a little bit of mid-range lacking in them. And to be able to get them to kind of cut through the mix a little bit more, I just did a 3 to 4 dB increase around 900. And I felt like that was helping those keys have definition in the mix. And then looking at the Keys 2 channel, I'm high passing these a lot. It's an organ channel, so you really don't want a ton of that low end. It could start interfering with your bass and other instruments and become muddy. So what I'm doing is a low mid cut around 650 to help with just some of that muddiness. And then I'm actually doing a boost on the high end, about 5 dB at 4K, and this helps just get that brilliance. And if this talk about how we're processing channels isn't really making sense, or your sources just aren't sounding quite right, we've actually got a free EQ cheat sheet for you to download and utilize each weekend for you and especially your volunteers. It's got things like problem frequencies that we find and other ways that we really process the channels to fit into the context of the mix. And a lot of what I'm doing right now is built on the foundations of that EQ cheat sheet. So that can be a really great resource for you and your volunteers to use in week and week out. Moving on, we've got our backing tracks, and these tracks sound really great just straight off the tracks rig, so I'm really not doing much to them. Let's listen to them, put them into the mix, and then we'll talk about what I'm doing as far as processing. So again, really high quality tracks. They sound great, nice and wide. These are straight from the people who wrote the songs, so they sound great just off the tracks rig. I've got a keys and perk channel, that's what you just heard. And then I've got a track vocal channel, which we'll listen to with the actual vocals. So looking at the keys, I'm just doing a high pass filter that's set to about 120, just to keep that out of the way of the bass and the kick. I'm doing a little low mid scoop around 320 just to clean up the low mids, and a scoop in the high mids around 2K. Again, just like the electric guitars, I'm trying to keep these out of the way of the vocal, and so that little scoop helps me to do that. Looking at the perk channel, the high pass filter is set right around 60 hertz. And the reason I do this is because we've got some kick and like tambourine hits, and I really want those kick hits to come through and have a lot of fullness in them. So I don't want to roll that high pass filter up too far to where it just sounds super thin. So I've got that at like 57 and just a very slight boost at 60 hertz. It's about 3 dB just to make sure there's enough fullness in those tracks and that they're consistent from the track kick and the actual acoustic kick. Moving right along to vocals, we've got 6 vocal channels on this file. Only 4 of them are being used in this song. And then we've got a track vocal. Again, just like everything else, we'll solo it, put it in the mix, and then we'll talk about what we're doing.
Lazarus, how did that great? Our God rewrites history. Jesus, you changed everything when you pour your spirit out. Just like Silas singing with Paul, praise can break down prison walls. Jesus, you can have it all. Won't you pour your spirit out? Oh, pour your spirit out. Pour your spirit out. And pour your spirit out. Come and pour your spirit all over this church. Pour your spirit out. Pour your spirit out. Pour your spirit
So talking about the processing that I'm doing on my vocals, I'll just start with vocal 1 because actually what I did is I dialed in the lead vocal and then I copied that processing to all of the other vocals. So what I've done on lead 1 applies to all the others. When we select it here, we can go into the EQ. And what I'm doing is, the very first thing that I'm doing is setting a high pass for this vocal channel because our vocals pick up a lot of PA bleed. They pick up all of that sub rumble. And if we leave that in, it completely muddies up our mix. And so for this one, I actually have the high pass filter set pretty high because there was pretty significant PA rumble. I've got this up to 344, which might not typically be what I do. I may have them set closer to 220, 250, to 270, depending on the singer. But for this instance, I'm using the tools that I have and adjusting to, the sources that I have. And I felt like about 344, 350 was right for this vocal. And then as far as the cuts that I'm doing, I have a low frequency cut, about 6 dB at 318 is what I have it. I find that anywhere between 315 to 330, there's just a lot of this just low end like throat noise, for lack of a better words, and that can really just muddy up your vocal. And so taking out some of that 315, 330 right in that range really helps to clean a lot of that up. Then we've got a cut right around 650 to take some of that boxiness out of the vocal. And then on our high mid band, we've got a 4-5 dB cut around 3K to help with harshness. This is a really big thing. I can't stand when the vocals are harsh because I like to push my vocals so that we can hear it, we can hear the message of the song, but if they're harsh, it basically ruins the whole mix for me. And so making sure that your vocals are smooth, they're not ear piercing, that anywhere from 2K to 4K, that's your harshness frequency, and that can really help make, smooth out your vocals whenever you're mixing them. And again, we're using the tools that we have. We don't have a de-esser on this one, but I did do a cut in the EQ around 8 to 9K to help with the sibilance. I noticed that with this singer, with this capsule, with this song, just this instance, that the sibilance was pretty distracting. It at times felt like it was kind of a little bit piercing. And so to help with that, I made that around 8K cut. I did about 7 dB, just I felt like that was what was needed. And the reason, like I said, it can help with some of that so-called piercing sound, but also I want to send the cleanest sources possible to my vocal effects because I don't want all of that sibilance, getting into my effects or, having to cut that out on the return. I want to send the cleanest source possible to those effects so that I have clean effects. And speaking of those effects, for effects on effects A, I've got a vintage plate reverb, and that is my vocal verb. I typically set the pre-delay pretty high, maybe around 90, 100 milliseconds, but I felt like for this vocal and this reverb unit, that 57 milliseconds felt really good. And then the reflection, which is basically like your size or your decay, is at 0.76. So that's like a medium slow decay. And then I just left the rest of the low pass, dampening, everything just stock where it was. On effects B, I've got a digital stereo delay. And then on effects C, I've got a hall reverb for my drums. So this is my snare and my tom reverb. I'm not doing a very high pre-delay, about 36 milliseconds. Could probably even go a little bit lower. Diffusion is at 0.75. Reflection, again, this is like your size or your decay is at 0.87, and then size is at 19.86. So these were the settings that worked for me and these tracks and the in-ears that I'm using, but these might not work for your vocalist and your room. And so this is definitely something that this is going to be one of the first things you want to address if you're using this same show file, is make sure these effects are working with your sources. Looking at the compressor for the vocal, I've got the FET compressor inserted here, and this is a emulation of the 1176, just like we had on the bass. For this, I've got a fast attack and fast release, and then I've got the ratio set at 4:1. So this is hitting anywhere from 3 to 4 dB in the lower parts of the song, and then like 8 to maybe even 10 dB in the bigger choruses, bigger bridges. And what this does is it just keeps my vocal super consistent. And when we try to aim for vocal intelligibility in our mix, this is a really big part of that, is making sure that the vocal stays compressed and it stays at a constant level all the time, so that we're not having to constantly ride our fader of that vocal. And so, just like I said, I've got these same settings applied to the rest of the vocal, so we're hitting about 3 to 4 dB in the low parts, 8 to 10 in the high parts, and this is giving me just a really good, consistent vocal sound. So we've walked through everything from drums to guitars to vocals and tracks and effects. So one more time, let's just put it all together. I'm gonna mix the song just like I would on a Sunday morning, and just hear our final results.
Our God rewrites history. Jesus, you change everything when you pour your spirit out. Just like Silas singing with Paul, praise can break down prison walls. Jesus, you can have it all. Won't you pour your spirit out? Pour your spirit out. Pour your spirit out. Come pour your spirit. Pour your spirit out. 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 Pour your spirit out.
So thanks for hanging with me as we mix on the Studiolive. Those resources that I mentioned, the show file that I'm using today, the mixing cheat sheet, and even these tracks from our friends at Thrive are available for you to download. So go in the description, click the links to get these resources, and make your mix better this weekend. So we've got a lot more resources coming your way. So to stay up to date, subscribe to our YouTube channel and be on the lookout for future videos to come. We'll see you in the next video.